Valentine's gift to America and to the American people, he has an odd way of showing his affection. It is the equivalent of taking your fiancée to dinner, asking her to marry you, and then leaving her to take care of the check your maxed out credit cards and underwater mortgage and the bill for the ring. This budget is quite simply an abdication of adult responsibility, and it is a particular abdication of the responsibility of the President of the United States, who takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution. Our economy is dealing with the hangover of the 2008 economic collapse, the greatest fiscal crisis that I've seen and that we've seen in several generations. Our recovery has been sluggish, and it is not being helped by this administration's regulatory overload and Obamacare, which is set to kill 800,000 jobs. Yet we can already see a still larger crisis approaching. This is nothing short of an existential challenge. Continued deficits and accumulated debt are a genuine threat to individual liberty, continued prosperity, and national security. Absent immediate action, and let me stress that this needs to be immediate action, we face a future where our union is not more perfect, and where government will stand in the way of enterprising businesses and citizens whose only wish is the opportunity to thrive. Yet the President's response to this impending disaster is to vote present. His response was to pass the buck. With due respect, the budget released today is a sorry joke. I would hate to be the White House staffers forced to spin this budget as a step in the right direction. The United States is demanding a Churchill on the issue of deficits and debt, but the administration has delivered us a Chamberlain. Let me break this down. The administration is going to reduce the deficit by $1.1 trillion over 10 years. That sounds like a mighty big number, and I'm sure that the White House has some consultants who have told them that the American people can be duped into thinking that this represents meaningful deficit reduction or change. Let me be clear. This is not meaningful deficit reduction. The administration wants to reduce the deficit by $1.1 trillion over 10 years, total over 10 years. And what does the administration project the deficit to be for this fiscal year? $1.65 trillion. At 10.9% of the gross domestic product, this is the largest deficit as a share of the economy since World War II. Unbelievable. But it is consistent with the way Democrats have behaved since taking over Washington. In 2010, the deficit was $1.3 trillion, and in 2009, $1.4 trillion. So let's put this in perspective. The administration is out there touting its fiscal responsibility, yet its 10-year total deficit reduction is smaller than this year's deficit. The President's much-touted 5-year freeze on discretionary spending, which will save $400 billion, is smaller than the Congressional Budget Office's recent upward revision of the 2011 deficit. Spending this budget as the fiscally responsible thing to do betrays a profound lack of respect for the intelligence of American citizens. This budget contains $53 billion for construction of high-speed rail in Florida, California, and several other states. If there is a bigger government boondoggle out there, I'm not aware of it. But the Vice President, in promoting this spending spree, tells Americans that they need to get a grip. With due respect, the American people's grip on the situation is just fine. They understand something that apparently has eluded the best and brightest over on Pennsylvania Avenue. We are out of money. The well that has been financing the New Deal and the New Frontier and the Great Society and the stimulus and Obamacare has finally run dry. It is past time that we stop playing politics with the deficit and debt and make the tough choices that are necessary to put America's finances back on solid ground. Yet there's no effort in this budget to take care of our long-term fiscal problems. None at all. Not even the Washington Post is able to spin this one. This is a $3.7 trillion budget. And what is the future of our deficit and debt? This is what the Post had to say. After next year, the deficit will begin to fall, quote, settling around $600 billion a year through 2018, when it would once again begin to climb as a growing number of retirees tapped into Social Security and Medicare, unquote. The new normal under this budget is one of permanent budget deficits long after President Obama has returned to private life. He will be out working on his presidential library while Americans are left holding the bag for his big spending policies. He may not want to admit it, but the most fitting volume for his presidential library might be The Road to Serfdom. How exactly does the administration propose to pay for Social Security and Medicare and national defense under this budget? The bottom line, it doesn't. This budget amounts to gross negligence. Even the progressive blogger Ezra Klein concludes that when reading this budget, it's almost like the Fiscal Commission never happened. Remember that? The President's Fiscal Commission? It issued a report recommending over $4 trillion in cuts, including adjustments to entitlements. It offered controversial, but apparently appropriately bold, proposals to get our nation back on the right track. The President and his team looked at those proposals and bravely decided to leave these problems to the next administration and future generations. Clearly, I am not a fan, but there is one useful item to consider in this budget. It is what progressives might call a teachable moment. To achieve these paltry deficit reduction numbers, the administration had to resort to massive tax increases. As the Post concludes, the tax hikes in this bill will be around $1.6 trillion over 10 years. And here's the point that people need to be reminded of. Even with $2 trillion and possibly more in job-killing tax increases in this budget, it still comes nowhere close to reining in our deficits and debt. For years, we've heard Democrats say that if rich people and businesses paid their fair share in taxes, we could balance the budget and reduce the debt. Well, they sure tested it out on this budget. They soaked the so-called rich and American businesses with a fire hose, and yet we are still facing trillions in debt and hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits. After the much maligned Bush tax cuts expire and undermine small business job creation, according to the President's own numbers, we will still have to borrow an additional $7.2 trillion through 2021 to pay the bills. The bills that are becoming due from the Obama administration's spending policies. This budget should be a turning point in our debate about deficit and debt reduction. Tax increases simply cannot get us there. Unfortunately, the message that tax increases lead to deficit reduction is the Democrats' good word. Over the past decade, I have participated in many discussions about spending and tax policy. As my colleague from Iowa, Senator Grassley, has noted, Democrats basically have two talking points. First, all of the good fiscal history of the 1990s was delivered from the partisan tax increase bill of 1993. And second, all of the bad fiscal history taking place within the past 10 years is owing to the bipartisan tax relief plans originally enacted during the last administration and continued under the present administration. The Democrats' platform does not, it does have the virtue of simplicity. Higher taxes, good. Lower taxes, bad. This record needs to be corrected. Regular viewers of C-SPAN 2 have probably heard others on my side do so before, but it bears repeating, particularly in light of today's budget, that higher taxes will not right our fiscal ship. The myth that higher taxes lead to lower deficits is a persistent one. This is the mainstream account of the Clinton tax hikes. According to this theory, the positive fiscal history of the 1990s resulted from the 1993 tax increases. It is a simple enough argument. According to the other side, by raising taxes and taking more money out of the economy, the government successfully reduced the deficit. Yet, as you can see from this chart, the Clinton administration's own Office of Management and Budget concluded that the 1993 tax increase in the green accounted for only 13% of deficit reduction between 1990 and 2000. Just look at this chart. Well, as a percentage of deficit reduction, the 1993 tax increase ranks behind other factors such as defense cuts and interest saving. Defense cuts, 35% in the brown, interest saving in the purple. The message here is simple. Tax increases did not drive deficit reduction. It may seem counterintuitive, but raising taxes does not necessarily mean that revenues collected by the government as a percentage of GDP will increase. Consider this chart, which compares changes in federal revenues as a percentage of GDP. And this is for two key four-year periods. Each of these four-year periods was preceded by a major tax policy change. Now let's look at this chart. The first four-year period occurred after the 1993 tax increase was enacted. That's the blue line. That's the first four-year period. The second four-year period occurred after the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 was enacted. The Jobs and Growth Reconciliation Act was the second of the major tax increase bills enacted during the last administration. It featured reductions on tax rates of capital gains and dividends. Now let's take a look at the first of those four-year periods in each case. 1 year after the 1993 tax hike, we do see increased revenues in that blue line. 1 year, okay? 1 year after the 2003 tax cut, revenues dropped on the red line from 1993 to 1994. But take a look at the second through fourth years following the adoption of each bill. You'll see the trend of the first year reverses itself in the second year after the tax hike. The blue line starts down. In the second year, the red line sharply shoots up. As the policies in both bills had time to take effect, the revenue patterns are clear. The positive change in revenue was generally greater after the tax cut bill than it was after the tax increase bill. There is no doubt that our deficits are a serious issue. They threaten the future of our nation. It is irresponsible, however, to say that our dire fiscal situation is the result of government not extracting enough money from the people who actually earn it. The President's budget, with its massive new tax increases and permanent deficits, demonstrates again that our problem is spending. Just look at it. Just look at it. Spending has not grown arithmetically. Spending has not grown geometrically. Spending has grown exponentially. Over the past few years, while Democrats exercise complete control over Washington, non-defense discretionary spending has grown by 24%. And as I've said before, that figure does not even include the bloated stimulus bill enacted in early 2009. Yet these deficits continue to grow in spite of increased revenues. On January 26, CBO published its budget and economic outlook for fiscal years 2011 through 2021. Going on to quote from that report, by CBO's estimates, federal revenues in 2011 will be $123 billion, or 6% more than total revenues recorded 2 years ago in 2009. This increase in federal revenues for 2011 includes the net effect from the 1 year across-the-board reduction in payroll taxes. The important fact here is that revenues have increased over the past 2 years, and the deficit has still increased. Our deficit and debt problems are not being driven by tax relief. And despite this evidence, many of my friends on the other side still see raising taxes as the best and only solution. They want to fund out-of-control spending by taking even more money from the people who actually earn it. Proponents of this approach know that the confiscation of what has been lawfully earned can be a hard sell. That's the reason they resort to clever rhetoric, telling us that paying taxes is inherently patriotic. Or we hear talking points about some people not paying their fair share. These sound bites might sound good to the base, but they are not grounded in reality. CBO has published a booklet entitled The Long-Term Budget Outlook. In its most recent version, CBO confirmed that federal revenues have fluctuated between 15% and 21% of GDP over the past 40 years averaging about 18%. Because of the recession, revenues dipped to around 15% recently. But that should not deceive us into thinking taxes are abnormally low. Using current law assumptions, CBO projected revenues to reach 23% of GDP by 2035. Arguably, those current law assumptions are unrealistic since they assumed the bipartisan tax relief enacted in 2001 and 2003 would expire, along with relief from the alternative minimum tax at the end of next year. Yet CBO evaluated an alternative, more realistic fiscal scenario. In that scenario, CBO assumed that most of the tax relief enacted in 2001 and 2003 would be extended through 2020. It still assumed that tax relief would expire for so-called high-income taxpayers. But CBO did anticipate that AMT relief would continue, along with other deviations from current law. AMT meaning the alternative minimum tax. Even using this alternative fiscal scenario, CBO found that revenues as a percentage of GDP would increase to just over 19% in 2020 and stay at that level for several years. That is to say, in this scenario, the level of taxation would still be above the 40-year historical average of 18% of GDP. Now, I want to briefly return to the January CBO analysis that I referred to earlier. That analysis, which assumes that most of the components of the tax package enacted at the end of 2010 will continue to be extended along with the modified estate and gift provisions also in that same legislation, calculates that annual government revenues will steadily increase going forward, but still average about 18% of GDP through 2021. I spent the past few minutes discussing the CBO projections of various policy scenarios. I'm sure this presentation is made for some very gripping television, but the point I'm trying to convey is a critical one. The fiscal reality is that taxes are not abnormally low. Continuing current tax policy yields federal revenues at about the historic average of GDP for the past 40 years. Increasing taxes on anyone, even so-called high earners, will push government revenues above the 40 years historical average as a percentage of GDP. I know there are many who would still support raising taxes above this historical level. The President has made it very clear today that he certainly does. But it is important to heed the words of the CBO before we raise taxes. In its long-term budget outlook, CBO had this to say about a scenario where the bipartisan tax relief of 2001 and 2003 expired, along with AMT relief. According to CBO, quote, marginal tax rates on income from labor and capital would rise considerably under the extended baseline scenario. The increase in the marginal tax rate on labor would reduce people's incentive to work, and the increase in the marginal tax rate on capital would reduce their incentive to save, unquote. Now, the basic point that I'm making is that tax hikes aren't like finding a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. That money has to come from somewhere, and there will be consequences to redistributing it. Moreover, as we saw in the budget released today, even spiking taxes by over $2 trillion will not help us to balance our books. Abnormally high spending drove the deficits of the past. It is like driving the deficits of today. It is driving the deficits of today. And it will drive the deficits of the future. Some folks, in response to the question of whether the President is triangulating after the drubbing Democrats took in November, have answered no. He's just being himself. You can say that again. He supported big government as a community organizer. He supported it as a senator on this floor and in the committees. He supported it as a presidential candidate. He supports it today. But the stakes are higher now. He is the nation's chief executive. And ultimately, the President is responsible for guiding our nation through the treacherous waters of an impending fiscal crisis. These are not easy shoals to navigate. Yet, the statesman really cannot shirk his or her duty. As Senator Henry Clay once put it, I would rather be right than be president. Some things are bigger than the next election, and getting our deficits under control is one of those things. The American people know that President Obama's budget is not right. The President administration is spending almost 25% of our GDP. Historically high, except during and shortly after World War II. The last time we had that kind of expenditure was in 1950. Yeah. That's why I'm so strongly for a balanced budget constitutional amendment. I wish we didn't have to go to that, but I don't see any other way that we'll get spending under control. Because I think Congress has been institutionally incapable of bringing down spending. And one reason is that with the help of the mainstream media, people out there actually believe that, or members of Congress actually believe that they'll be kept in office by spending. And up till now, that's been pretty true. But the American people are starting to wake up. They're starting to realize that, as sincere as some of my colleagues are on the other side, their economic philosophy is corrupt. Maybe corrupt's too strong a word, but it's wrong. Definitely wrong. Well, we know that the American people are not going to stop demanding real leadership on this issue. And I feel badly because I personally like the president, no question about it. I showed him great friendship when he was here. I've shown him friendship since he was elected. And we all know that in order to resolve these problems, we have to get entitlements under control. And as good as some of us are here in the Congress, we can't do it without presidential leadership. We just can't. I have a suggestion for the president. He would get down in history as one of the truly great presidents if he would work with us and work together, bringing bipartisan people together and work to resolve these conflicts. You can't do it with just 15% of the budget, and you can't do it with just tax increases. You can't do it with an ever-expanding federal government. You can't do it with an ever-expanding set of federal employees. You can't do it with ever-expanding regulations, although some of them are important. All of these things may be important, but you can't do it with those concepts. The only way you can do it is to get in and take the whole budget and work with both sides and see what we can do to bring people together and see if we have the courage to be able to resolve these problems, not only for today, but for our kids and grandkids, and in Elaine, in my case, great-grandkids as well, hereafter. I don't want the president to fail, but I have to point these things out. Let's face it, he's getting some very poor advice. And even when he wants to come to the center, he gets wrapped really hard on the knuckles by the far left in his party, most of whom are far left, at least those here on the floor. Very few moderates on the Democrat side. I have found that those who are moderate generally are people who are moderate when their vote doesn't count. And I think if you go back and look at the record, you'll find that to be true. But the vast majority of my friends on the other side really believe that we should keep spending and we should keep taxing, and that will keep them in power. But all the power in the world doesn't count if we're reckoning the greatest country in the world. I think our side has to wake up a little bit too. We can't just do it with tax cuts either. On the other hand, I'd much rather have tax cuts that spur on the economy and create small business jobs than to continue to spend us into oblivion. Nevertheless, we're all going to have to work together if we're ever going to get this problem solved. The only way I know to solve it is through presidential leadership combined with courage on the part of members of Congress. But the way they're solving it on this budget is pathetic. There are so many budgetary gimmicks in this bill that it's just plain pathetic. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, and that is the little over $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion in deficit reduction that this bill says it will do over 10 years. What is that, a little over $100 billion a year? That isn't even as much as our deficit for this year alone, 2011. And during those 10 years, there will be hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of continued deficits until we reach a point in about 2022 where we will be around $22 trillion in debt. Now, Mr. President, I don't know about you or anybody else in this chamber, but I think it's time for us to start standing up. I think it's time for the President to lead. I think the Democrats who have control of the bureaucracy ought to start working with us on let's get that bureaucracy trimmed down. And let's really consider the one aspect of constitutional politics that really has worked, and that is allowing 50 states to participate. And through 50 state laboratories, we can pick and choose the things that work best. Had we done that with health care, we would not be in the mess that health care is in today and the oblivion that it's headed for. We can't just do it with tax increases. And frankly, my experience has been that tax increases really don't work. What really does work is giving the small business sector incentives, real incentives. Not, quote, investments, unquote, but real incentives to keep creating the 70% of jobs that only the small business sector can do. If we increase those taxes, we're going to be in a mess. And I can just tell you, the budgeteers at OMB and CBO, as sincere and dedicated as they may be, I like Mr. Liu very much. I think Mr. Elmendorf is a very fine budgeteer and economist, but they are always low in their estimates of deficits. It could be much worse than what we know right now. So, Mr. President, I hope that we will have the guts, I hope the President will have the guts to lead, and I hope that we'd have the guts to follow that lead and hopefully turn this ship of state around. Mr. President, I yield the floor.